The first thing I noticed when I opened the door was the smell. Damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron mixed with the sharp tang of wet soil. The air inside was heavy, thicker than it should have been, as though the house itself was holding its breath. My fingers brushed against the cold brass doorknob as I stepped inside, and a faint creak echoed through the silence, reverberating off the hollow walls like a warning. The house was exactly as we had left it. Dust clung to every surface. The faint outlines of long-forgotten furniture visible beneath faded white sheets. The wallpaper was peeling, curling at the edges like dry parchment, revealing dark, cracked wood beneath. The grandfather clock in the corner, its face cracked and frozen at some unknown hour, loomed like a sentinel. And yet, there was something off, an unease that settled deep in my chest, a feeling that something was wrong. I wasn't alone. The faint whisper of footsteps brushed against my ears, so soft I might have imagined it, but I knew better. I'd felt the presence the moment I crossed the threshold, like an invisible weight pressing down on me, following me, watching me. My breath came in shallow bursts as I gripped the flashlight tighter, the weak beam trembling as it cut through the shadows. I stepped further inside, my boots crunching softly against the dirt and debris that had accumulated on the warped wooden floor. The light from the doorway faded behind me, swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the house. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet felt amplified, louder than it should have been, like the house was reacting to me, acknowledging my presence. And then I saw it, a faint glimmer of light, so brief and faint I almost missed it. It came from the far end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to gather, thick and impenetrable. My pulse quickened as I moved toward it, my footsteps hesitant, each one heavier than the last. The air grew colder the closer I got, sharp and biting, each breath visible in the dim beam of the flashlight. The glimmer was coming from a door, ajar, its edge splintered and warped, as though it had been forced open long ago. The light beyond it flickered faintly, erratic and unnatural, casting shifting shadows that danced along the walls. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorframe, the mark on my palm burning faintly, as though in warning. But something pulled me forward, a force I couldn't resist, urging me to step inside. The room was empty. At least, that's what I told myself at first. The flickering light I'd seen was coming from an old lantern hanging on the far wall. Its glass cracked, the flame inside guttering weakly. The air here was colder, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The shadows deeper and darker than they should have been. And then the smell hit me. It was stronger here, sharper, a nauseating blend of decay and damp earth. My stomach churned as I raised the flashlight, sweeping its beam across the room. The walls were covered in carvings, jagged, erratic lines etched deep into the wood, forming patterns that spiraled and twisted in ways that made my head ache. They weren't random. They were deliberate, precise, a language I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. And then the whispering began. It was faint at first, threading through the silence like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but it grew louder, sharper, a chaotic symphony of voices that pressed against my thoughts, drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. My name was among them, repeated over and over, weaving through the whispers like a thread of barbed wire. Emma, Derit, Benny, Tennis, Tom, Divildel, Trucks. The sound of it froze me in place, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the chaos with an unrelenting force. My chest tightened as the shadows began to move, flickering and bending at the edges of the light, converging toward the center of the room. I turned sharply, my flashlight trembling as it swept across the walls, but there was nothing there, nothing I could see. Oh, the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and blending into one, pressing against me until it felt as though my skull might split. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their jagged lines twisting and warping as though alive. My legs trembled as I backed away, my hands scraping against the rough wood of the doorframe. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from the shadows gathering in the center of the room. And then it appeared. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs spindly and jagged, bending at unnatural angles as it stepped forward. Its surface shimmered faintly, translucent and flickering, like static on a broken screen. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its presence pressed against me with an unrelenting force that made my knees buckle. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew stronger, suffocating, pressing against me like a vice. My chest heaved as I scrambled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor, its beam casting erratic patterns across the walls. The light from the lantern flared suddenly, casting jagged shadows that twisted and writhed along the walls. The carvings glowed brighter, their lines spiraling inward, converging toward the center of the room, where the figure stood. The air grew heavier, sharper, each breath cutting through my lungs like shards of ice. And then the voice came, louder now, cutting through the silence with an authority that left no room for resistance. You opened the way. The words sank into me, deep and sharp, carving into the edges of my thoughts like a blade. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, the cold wood biting into my skin. The figure stepped closer, its jagged limbs bending and twisting as it loomed over me. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed everything was its faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move. The darkness didn't recede all at once. It was Helwa, the two at once. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating, as if it had soaked into my skin. My breaths came shallow and uneven, each one tasting of damp wood and decay. The lantern's weak glow barely illuminated the room now, flickering like it might snuff out at any moment. My flashlight was still on the floor where it had fallen, its beam trembling as though it too was afraid. I tried to gather myself, to stand, but the weight pressing against me was relentless. My legs felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. My muscles sluggish and unresponsive. The mark on my palm flared again, its icy fire spreading through my veins, rooting itself deep within my chest. It wasn't pain. Not exactly. It was worse than that. It felt like the mark was tethered to something I couldn't see. Something vast and ancient and unyielding. The whispering returned. It came soft and insistent, threading through the silence like smoke, weaving itself into the faint hum that now vibrated through the floor and into my chest. My name was there again, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the overlapping voices with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Emma. Dal coriunt. Such. Emma. I froze. The sound of my name wasn't coming from the room. Elvideur. Elect. Daddy. Elita. It was inside my head, echoing against the walls of my mind, threading through my thoughts like a splinter that refused to be removed. The shadows on the walls began to move again, stretching and bending toward the center of the room where the figure had stood moments before. My chest tightened as the carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the same point. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me. The figure was gone, or at least I thought it was, but the shadows it had left behind were wrong. Thicker, darker, as though they were no longer bound to the edges of the room. They twisted and flickered in the flickering light, their jagged edges stretching toward the door like reaching hands. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, now, their lines twisting into patterns. I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward toward the door, my hands brushing against the splintered wood as I turned to flee. The whispering followed me, threading through the air like tendrils, wrapping around me and pulling me back toward the room. My chest heaved as I shoved the door open, the cold air of the hallway biting against my skin as I stumbled out. The house wasn't the same. Phew. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. The wooden floor warped and uneven, the walls lined with the same jagged carvings that had overtaken the room. The air was thicker now, colder, each breath scraping against my lungs like shards of glass. My flashlight sputtered weakly in my hand, its beam flickering as I swept it across the walls. The hum followed me. Edwis Gabriel Siu Dimfort. It was low and rhythmic, threading through the silence like the beat of a distant drum, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. The mark on my palm flared in response, its icy fire spreading through my veins, sensing with the relentless rhythm of the hum. My hand trembled as I raised the flashlight, the light catching on something at the far end of the hallway. A door. Nay, it shouldn't have been there. The door was massive and imposing, its surface covered in the same jagged carvings that adorned the walls. The lines twisted and spiraled outward, converging at the center, where a faint light pulsed faintly, as though the door itself were alive. My chest tightened as the whispering grew louder, threading through the hum with an urgency that made my head spin. You must continue. and must continue. The voice was louder now, cutting through the chaos with an authority that left no room for resistance. My legs moved on their own, dragging me toward the door, despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift as I passed, their lines twisting and bending toward the pulsing light at the center of the door. Ah! The air grew heavier with each step, the weight of the house pressing down on me like a physical force. My chest heaved as I reached the door, the mark on my palm burning fiercely as the icy fires surged through me. The carvings on the door pulsed in time with the hum, their jagged lines twisting and warping as though alive. And then the door opened. The light that spilled out was blinding, sharp and cold, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very fabric of the house, and the shadows surged forward, their jagged forms collapsing into the light. My breath caught in my throat as the air around me seemed to collapse inward, dragging me into the light against my will. The last thing I saw before the darkness returned was the door slamming shut behind me, its jagged carvings twisting violently, bending reality itself as the light consumed everything. The light swallowed me whole. It wasn't like stepping into another room. It was like being submerged, pulled under by something cold and relentless. My body felt weightless, untethered, but at the same time, the pressure around me was unbearable, suffocating. My chest heaved as I tried to pull air into my lungs. But the air here wasn't like the air in the house. It was thick, metallic, and sharp, scraping against my throat like tiny blades. When the light faded, I was no longer in the hallway. Shapes. The room I found myself in wasn't a room at all. The walls were jagged and uneven, their surfaces rippling like water, reflecting fragments of light that twisted and bent unnaturally. The ground beneath me felt unstable, shifting slightly with every movement as though I were standing on the surface of something alive. The carvings were here too, etched deeply into every surface, their jagged lines glowing faintly with a sickly green light. They spiraled outward from the center of the room, converging at a single point, a massive, circular pit that seemed to drop endlessly into darkness. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor and into my chest, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. My legs trembled as I stepped closer to the edge of the pit, each step dragging me forward like an unseen force was pulling me. The light from the carvings pulsed brighter with every step, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls, their jagged forms twisting and bending as though alive. And then I heard it. The whispering wasn't distant anymore. It was everywhere, threading through the air like smoke, wrapping around me and pressing against my thoughts. My name was there again, repeated over and over, sharp and insistent, weaving through the voices like a thread of barbed wire. Emma. Dali beeps. Almost clear. Ka. The sound of it stopped me in my tracks. Envelop. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, the cold surface biting into my skin. My hands scraped against the jagged edges of the carvings, and the mark on my palm burned fiercely, its icy fire threading through my veins and rooting itself deep within my chest. The whispers sharpened, their tone urgent, threading through the hum with an intensity that made my head spin. You are the key. The voice was singular now, cutting through the chaos with an authority that left no room for resistance. My chest tightened as the carvings pulsed violently, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the center of the pit. The shadows along the walls bent and twisted, their flickering forms stretching toward the center, collapsing into the darkness like drops of ink sinking into water. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath slicing through my lungs like shards of glass. The mark on my palm flared brighter, syncing with the pulsing rhythm of the room, its icy fire surging through my veins. My body moved on its own, dragging me toward the edge of the pit, the pull of it stronger than anything I'd ever felt. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor and into my bones, and the whispering returned, louder now, threading through the air with a ferocity that made my stomach churn. And then I saw it. The darkness in the pit wasn't empty. It moved, rippling and twisting, its jagged edges flickering like static on a broken screen. It rose slowly, stretching impossibly tall, its translucent form bending and warping in ways that defied comprehension. Its faceless void tilted upward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an unrelenting force that made my breath catch in my throat. The voice came again, louder this time, threading through the hum with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. Seal it or be consumed. The words carved into me, deep and sharp, leaving no space for resistance. My hands trembled as the light from the carvings flared brighter, consuming the room in a blinding burst that made my vision blur. The shadows surged forward, collapsing into the pit, their jagged forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. The figure rose higher, its jagged limbs stretching outward, bending and twisting at impossible angles. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space like heat rising from asphalt, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very fabric of the room. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, the mark on my palm burning brighter than ever, its icy fire threading through my veins and syncing with the relentless rhythm of the hum. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed everything was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the light from the carvings twisting violently, bending reality itself until nothing remained. The darkness wasn't a void. It was alive, pulsating and shifting like a living thing. It pressed against my chest, wrapping around me with an unbearable weight that made it impossible to draw a full breath. My body felt both weightless and impossibly heavy, as though I were suspended in some in-between place where gravity had no meaning. My pulse thundered in my ears, syncing with the rhythmic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The light returned, but it wasn't natural. It seeped through the cracks in the ground, a cold, sharp green that illuminated the jagged carvings, spiraling along every surface. The floor beneath me wasn't solid anymore. It shifted and groaned under my weight. The carvings etched into it, pulsing faintly like veins. I could feel the energy in them, a vibration that crawled through my skin and settled deep in my bones. The air was colder now, sharper, each breath cutting through my lungs like shards of glass. The hum grew louder, resonating through the ground and into my chest, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. My legs trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, the weight of the place pressing down on me, dragging at every movement. The carvings on the walls weren't static. They twisted and writhed, their jagged lines spiraling inward toward the center of the room, where the pit gaped wide, a dark, endless void that seemed to pull at everything around it. The shadows on the walls bent and stretched toward the pit, their flickering forms dissolving into the darkness like drops of ink. The hum deepened, vibrating through the very fabric of the room, and the mark on my palm burned fiercely, its icy fire threading through my veins and rooting itself deep within my chest. And then I heard it again. The whispering. It wasn't faint anymore. She will be no. It was loud, sharp, threading through the hum with an intensity that made my head spin. My name was there again, repeated over and over, weaving through the voices like a thread of barbed wire. Emma. Emma. The sound of it froze me in place. My chest tightened as the air grew heavier, pressing against me like a physical force. The carvings flared brighter, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the pit. The shadows along the walls flickered violently, their jagged edges stretching and bending as though alive. And then it appeared. The figure rose from the pit, its translucent form flickering like static, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long. It moved slowly, deliberately, its surface shimmering faintly, as though it existed just beyond the boundaries of reality. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an unrelenting force. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. The hum surged again, low and resonant, threading through the air like a pulse, syncing with the rhythm of the carvings as they flared brighter. The figure raised one elongated arm, its jagged edges bending and twisting, and pointed directly at me. The voice came again, sharp and deliberate, threading through the hum with an authority that left no room for resistance. You have come too far. There is no turning back. The words pressed against me, carving into my mind with a clarity that left no room for escape. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an unseen force, each step pulling me closer to the edge of the pit. The shadows surged forward, collapsing into the darkness, their flickering forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor and into my chest, and the mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire threading through my veins. The figure loomed over me, its jagged limbs bending and twisting as it stepped closer. The light from the carvings twisted violently, bending reality itself. And the air around me grew heavier, sharper, each breath scraping against my lungs like shards of ice. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, the cold surface biting into my skin. And then the voice came one final time, louder now, cutting through the chaos with a finality that made my chest tighten. Seal it or be consumed. The words struck me like a blow, sharp and final, carving into the deepest parts of my mind. The light from the carvings flared brighter, consuming the room in a blinding burst, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very fabric of the space. The mark on my palm burned fiercely, its icy fire spreading through my veins, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the room. The last thing I saw before the darkness returned was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the shadows collapsing into the pit, their jagged forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. The darkness around me felt heavier this time, as though it carried weight and purpose. It wasn't just absence, it was suffocation, pressing into every inch of me, filling my lungs with something sharp and cold. My hands scraped against the uneven ground, the jagged edges biting into my skin as I tried to steady myself. My breathing was shallow, every inhale trembling, as if my lungs were rejecting the air. The hum was still there, a relentless vibration threading through the floor and into my chest, syncing with my heartbeat. The mark on my palm burned hotter, its icy fire searing through my veins, pulsing in time with the rhythmic thrum that resonated in the space. I couldn't see the pit anymore, but I could feel it, a gravitational pull that tugged at every part of me, dragging me closer even as I tried to resist. The light returned slowly, leaking through the cracks in the ground like molten glass. It wasn't the same sickly green glow as before. It was sharper, colder, twisting into jagged beams that bent and refracted unnaturally. The carvings were still there, spiraling outward from the center of the space, their jagged lines glowing faintly as they twisted and warped. The air grew colder with each passing second, each breath slicing through my lungs like shards of glass. And then the whispering began again. It came sharper this time, threading through the hum, with an intensity that made my head spin. My name was among the voices, repeated over and over, sharp and insistent, cutting through the overlapping cacophony like a thread of barbed wire. Emma, to you, died today. The sound of it froze me in place. My legs trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, the ground shifting and groaning beneath me as though it too was alive. The light from the carvings pulsed faintly, casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls, their jagged edges twisting and bending as though alive. And then I saw it. The figure was back, but it wasn't rising from the pit this time. It was here, in the room with me, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it moved toward me. Its surface flickered like static, translucent and warping, its edges shimmering faintly, as though it existed just outside the boundaries of reality. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an unrelenting force that made my knees buck. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew stronger, suffocating, pressing against me like a vice. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground and into my bones, and the carvings on the walls flared brighter, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the center of the space. The voice came again, sharp and deliberate, threading through the hum with an authority that left no room for resistance. "You are the key. Finish what you started." The words pressed against me, carving into my mind with a clarity that left no space for denial. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an invisible force, each step pulling me closer to the center of the space where the carvings converged into a jagged spiral. The shadows flickered violently, their forms bending and stretching toward the spiral, collapsing into its pulsing light like drops of ink dissolving in water. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against me like a physical weight, dragging me down with every movement. My chest tightened as the mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire spreading through my veins, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the hum. The carvings on the floor pulsed violently, their jagged lines twisting and warping as though alive. And the spiral opened. The ground beneath it split apart, revealing a chasm of light and shadow, twisting and writhing in ways that made my stomach churn. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very fabric of the space, and the figure stepped closer, its translucent form bending and warping, as though it were part of the spiral itself. The voice came one final time, louder now, cutting through the chaos with a finality that made my chest tighten. "Seal it, or it will consume you." The words struck me like a blow, sharp and final, carving into the deepest parts of my mind. My hands trembled as the light from the spiral flared brighter, consuming the room in a blinding burst that made my vision blur. The shadows surged forward, collapsing into the spiral, their flickering forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. The figure loomed over me, its jagged limbs bending and twisting as it reached out. The last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was its faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the spiral twisting violently, bending reality itself until nothing remained. The light engulfed everything, sharp and blinding, tearing at my vision until it was all I could see. My body felt weightless and stretched, as though I had been unraveled and reassembled in fragments. The hum roared through me, resonating deep in my chest, shaking loose every thought and leaving behind only static and the faint burn of the mark on my palm. When the light receded, I wasn't sure if I had emerged, or if it had simply left me behind. The room was no longer the same. The ground beneath me shifted with every step, unstable and alive. The carvings pulsing faintly with a greenish light that illuminated the jagged edges of the walls. The air was heavier here, saturated with something thick and metallic, a taste that lingered on my tongue and left my throat raw. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering erratically as though they were no longer tethered to anything real. At the center of the room, the spiral was still open, gaped wide, its edges twisting, warping, as though the darkness within it was consuming the world around it. The jagged lines of the carving spiraled inward, their sharp edges glowing brighter, with each passing second, converging into a single pulsing point at the center of the void. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor and into my bones, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. The figure was waiting for me. It stood at the edge of the spiral, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending and twisting at unnatural angles. Its translucent form flickered and warped, as though it were caught between this world and another, its edges shimmering faintly with the same sickly green light as the carvings. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an intensity that made my knees buckle. The whispering returned, threading through the hum with a sharpness that made my head spin. My name was there again, repeated over and over, sharp and insistent, cutting through the chaos like a jagged blade. Emma. Ditulve, tidol, Emma. The sound of it froze me in place. Muwali. My chest heaved as I struggled to move, my legs trembling beneath me as though they no longer obeyed me. The mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire threading through my veins and rooting itself deep within my chest. The carvings pulsed violently, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the center of the spiral where the figure stood. The voice came again, louder this time, cutting through the whispers with an authority that left no room for resistance. You must finish it. The words pressed against me, carving into my thoughts like splinters, leaving no room for denial. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an unseen force, each step pulling me closer to the edge of the spiral. The ground beneath me shifted and groaned, the carvings glowing brighter as the hum deepened, vibrating through the very fabric of the space. The shadows surged forward, their flickering forms bending and stretching toward the spiral, collapsing into its pulsing light. The figure raised one elongated arm, its jagged edges bending and twisting as it pointed toward the void. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their lines warping and bending as though reality itself were unraveling. The voice came again, sharper now, threading through the hum with an urgency that made my chest tighten. Seal it, or be consumed. The air grew colder with each passing second, sharper, each breath slicing through my lungs like shards of glass. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, the cold surface biting into my skin. The light from the spiral flared brighter, consuming the room in a blinding burst that made my vision blur. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the floor and into my chest, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the mark on my palm. The figure stepped closer, its jagged limbs bending and twisting as it loomed over me. The light from the spiral twisted violently, bending reality itself, and the shadows collapsed into the void, their jagged forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. My hands trembled as the mark on my palm burned brighter, its icy fire spreading through my veins, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the room. The last thing I saw before the darkness returned was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the spiral twisting violently, consuming everything in its path until nothing remained. The void pulled me under, its darkness swallowing me completely. There was no ground beneath me, no walls around me, just an endless abyss that seemed to stretch in every direction. The hum was deafening now, reverberating through my body as if I had become a part of it, or it a part of me. The mark on my palm burned fiercely, its icy fire searing through my veins, tethering me to whatever this place was. I didn't know if I was falling or floating, but the sensation of movement was undeniable. The light from the carvings still flickered faintly in the distance, spiraling outward like the tendrils of some massive cosmic entity. The air here wasn't air at all. It was thick and viscous, clinging to my skin and pressing against my chest with every shallow breath I managed to take. And then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, maybe more, emerging from the edges of the abyss. They were translucent and jagged, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, their forms flickering like broken reflections in a cracked mirror. They moved slowly, deliberately, their faceless voids tilting toward me as if they were watching, waiting. The hum surged louder, vibrating through the void, syncing with the erratic rhythm of my heartbeat. The whispering returned, threading through the hum like a needle, pulling at the edges of my mind. Wait, my name was among the voices, repeated over and over, sharp and insistent, cutting through the cacophony like a jagged blade. Emma, Tuyuma, I, Kul, Sels, Gay. The sound of it pressed against me, carving into my thoughts with an intensity that left no room for escape. The figures moved closer, their jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending and twisting as they surrounded me. The void itself seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing, suffocating and unrelenting. And then the voice came. It wasn't a whisper this time. Eerie. It was sharp, clear, cutting through the chaos with an authority that made my chest tighten. The pact must be fulfilled. The words struck me like a physical blow, their weight pressing down on me, rooting me in place. The mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire spreading through my veins, syncing with the pulsing rhythm of the void. The figures loomed over me, their jagged forms bending and warping as though they were part of the void itself. The light returned, sharp and blinding, seeping through the cracks in the void like molten glass. It spiraled outward, twisting and bending in ways that made my stomach churn, converging at a single point just beyond my reach. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very fabric of the void, and the whispering sharpened, threading through the chaos with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. Choose. Ah. The word echoed through me, carving into the edges of my thoughts like a blade. The figures moved closer, their jagged limbs reaching toward me, their translucent forms flickering like static. The light from the spiral flared brighter, consuming everything in its path, bending reality itself as it twisted and warped. I didn't know what I was supposed to choose. The void offered no answers, only pressure. Unrelenting, suffocating pressure that threatened to tear me apart. My hands trembled as I reached toward the light. The mark on my palm, burning fiercely as it flared brighter, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the void. The figures around me dissolved into the light, their jagged forms breaking apart and scattering like shards of glass. The voice came again, louder now, sharp and final, threading through the hum with an intensity that made my chest heave. Seal it, or let it take you. The words pressed against me, carving into the deepest parts of my mind. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an unseen force, each step pulling me closer to the spiral of light. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath slicing through my lungs like shards of ice. The hum surged again, vibrating through the void, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. And then the spiral opened. The light consumed everything, sharp and blinding, tearing through the void with a force that made my vision blur. The hum reached its peak, vibrating through the very fabric of existence, and the shadows collapsed into the light, their jagged forms breaking apart and dissolving into nothingness. The last thing I saw before the void consumed everything was the spiral twisting violently, bending reality itself until there was nothing left but light and silence. The asylum loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette barely visible through the swirling fog. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I turned onto the gravel path, the crunch of the tires echoing into the quiet night. The air seemed heavier here, charged with a kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. It's My chest tightened as I approached the gates. Rusted iron bars twisted and bent like something had forced its way through. I killed the engine, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It pressed against my ears, amplifying the sound of my own breathing and the faint whisper of the wind weaving through the overgrown trees. The headlights illuminated the front of the asylum, its stone facade crumbling and choked with ivy. The windows were dark, broken in places, but somehow it felt like the building was watching me. Stepping out of the car, I tugged my coat tighter around me as the chill bit into my skin. The smell hit me first: damp earth, decaying wood, and something metallic, like rusted iron. It clung to the air, sharp and sour, seeping into my nostrils with every breath. My flashlight flickered as I turned it on, the beam weak, but enough to cut through the dense fog. The front doors groaned loudly, as I pushed them open, the sound reverberating through the cavernous halls. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with dust, and something else I couldn't place. My footsteps echoed as I stepped onto the cracked tile floor, each step sending faint vibrations through the space. Shadows stretched long and deep under the flashlight's beam, dancing across the walls like they were alive. The place felt wrong, even before I saw the carvings. At first, they were subtle, small scratches on the wooden panels lining the hallway, marks that could have been anything. But as I moved deeper, the carvings grew more deliberate. Symbols I didn't recognize, spiraled and twisted, etched deeply into the walls and floors. They glinted faintly under the flashlight, as though they'd been freshly carved, despite the thick layer of dust that covered everything else. The hum started then, so faint I almost didn't notice it. A low, rhythmic vibration threading through the air, so subtle it could have been my imagination. But the further I walked, the louder it became, resonating deep in my chest like the distant echo of machinery. My fingers tightened around the flashlight as I turned a corner, the beam landing on a door at the end of the hall. The door was different from the others. It was intact, its surface smooth and dark, but covered in the same spiraling carvings that had taken over the walls. The hum seemed to emanate from it, vibrating faintly through the floor as I approached. Ah! My heart pounded in my chest, each beat syncing with the hum, as though the door was pulling me into its rhythm. I hesitated, but something compelled me forward. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into my skin. The door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The light inside was unnatural, a cold, flickering glow that seemed to have no source. The air here was sharper, metallic, and my breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside. The room was lined with shelves, their surfaces cluttered with strange objects. Unmarked jars filled with dark liquids, rusted tools, and bundles of dried herbs that crumbled at the slightest touch. In the center of the room sat a chest, its surface etched with the same spiraling carvings that covered the door. It pulsed faintly under the light, as though it was alive, its vibrations syncing with the hum that filled the space. I crouched beside it, my fingers brushing against the rough surface. The moment I touched it, the hum surged louder, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. My breath quickened as I lifted the lid, the hinges creaking loudly in the oppressive silence. Inside was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. The pages inside were yellowed with age, the writing faint but legible. The words didn't make sense at first, fragmented phrases about sealing the breach, the blood debt, and a pact that binds. But the further I read, the more the words began to sink in, threading through my thoughts like barbed wire. The air shifted suddenly, a cold gust sweeping through the room that extinguished the flickering light. My flashlight flickered violently, its beam casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. The hum deepened, vibrating through the very fabric of the space, and for a moment I thought I heard whispering, soft, insistent, threading through the darkness. The shadows began to move. Elola, Ewas began to move. They stretched and bent, converging toward the center of the room, their jagged edges flickering like flames. My chest tightened as the carvings on the walls began to glow faintly, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the chest. The whispering grew louder, threading through the hum with an urgency that made my head spin. And then I saw it. The figure emerged from the darkness, its spindly limbs stretching impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it stepped forward. Its translucent form flickered like static, its jagged edges warping and twisting, as though it couldn't hold itself together. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an unrelenting force. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. My chest heaved as the mark on my palm flared with an icy fire, spreading through my veins and sensing with the relentless rhythm of the hum. The figure loomed over me, its jagged limbs bending and twisting, and pointed directly at the journal. The last thing I heard before the light consumed everything was a voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos. Seal it. The light dimmed just enough for me to see again, but it didn't bring relief. If anything, the shadows seemed deeper now, more alive, as though they had gained some sentience from whatever had just occurred. The journal still rested in my trembling hands, the weight of it heavier than it should have been, as though the words inside were pressing against me, demanding my attention. I didn't want to open it again, but the mark on my palm flared, sending a wave of icy fire through my veins, compelling me forward. My fingers moved against my will, flipping the brittle pages, the jagged handwriting on each one more frantic than the last. Symbols I didn't understand danced in the margins, twisting and spiraling into shapes that made my head throb just to look at them. The breach must remain sealed. The blood must flow. The pact cannot be broken. The words swam in front of my eyes, their meaning elusive, but their weight undeniable. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly in response, their jagged lines glowing brighter with each passing second. The hum was back, low and rhythmic, threading through the air like the distant echo of a heartbeat. My heartbeat. The journal's final pages were stuck together, their edges brittle and darkened as though they had been scorched. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the last page, as the hum grew louder, vibrating through the room and into my chest. Oh! The whispering returned, threading through the hum with a sharpness that made my stomach churn. Read it. The voice wasn't mine, but it came from inside me, threading through my thoughts like a needle pulling at the edges of my mind. My breath caught in my throat as I flipped to the final page. The words scrawled there jagged and uneven, as though they had been written in a frenzy. One must be chosen. One must bleed. The breach cannot close without the debt being paid. My chest tightened as the words sank in, their meaning crashing over me like a wave. The whispering grew louder, threading through the hum with an urgency that made my hands tremble. The carvings on the walls twisted violently, their lines spiraling inward toward the center of the room, where the chest still rested, its surface glowing faintly. And then the shadows moved. They flickered and bent, their jagged edges stretching outward, converging toward the journal in my hands. My legs buckled under the weight of the room, and I collapsed to my knees, the cold surface biting into my skin. The mark on my palm flared brighter, syncing with the pulsing rhythm of the carvings, and the icy fire spread through my veins, rooting itself deep within my chest. The hum surged louder, vibrating through the floor and into my bones, and the whispering sharpened, threading through the chaos with an intensity that made my head spin. My name was among the voices now, repeated over and over, sharp and insistent, cutting through the cacophony like a jagged blade. Emma. Tadinu. Sult. Tali. Loliura. Emma. The sound of it froze me in place, sharp and deliberate, carving into my thoughts with an authority that left no room for resistance. My breath came in shallow bursts as I struggled to stand, my legs trembling beneath me as though they no longer obeyed me. The shadows surged forward, collapsing into the chest, their flickering forms breaking apart and dissolving into the pulsing light. The carvings flared brighter, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the center of the room where the chest rested. The hum deepened, vibrating through the very fabric of the space, and for a moment the light consumed everything. When it receded, the room had changed again. The walls were no longer static. They twisted and writhed, their surfaces rippling like water, the carvings growing and shifting as though they were alive. The air was colder now, sharper, each breath slicing through my lungs like shards of glass. The shadows were everywhere, flickering at the edges of my vision, their jagged forms bending and twisting as though they were watching, waiting. And then it appeared. The figure stepped forward, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it moved closer. Its surface shimmered faintly, translucent and warping, as though it couldn't hold itself together. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an intensity that made my knees buckle. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. The hum surged again, low and resonant, vibrating through the air like a pulse, syncing with the rhythm of the carvings as they flared brighter. The voice came again, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence with an authority that left no room for hesitation. Choose. En. Carols. Inter. Twos. Deus. The word pressed against me, carving into my thoughts with a clarity that left no room for denial. The mark on my palm burned fiercely, its icy fire spreading through my veins, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the room. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an unseen force, each step pulling me closer to the chest. The last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the carvings twisting violently, bending reality itself until nothing remained. The darkness returned, thicker and heavier than before, swallowing everything around me. It pressed into my chest, my lungs struggling to expand against the weight of it. The mark on my palm was a brand now, burning with icy intensity, spreading fire through my veins that reached every corner of my body. I didn't know if I was standing, falling, or floating. There was no floor, no walls, nothing solid to anchor me, just the hum. It wasn't faint anymore. It roared through the void, vibrating deep in my chest, a relentless rhythm that didn't just fill the space. It was the space. Every beat sent ripples through the blackness, faint traces of light sparking along invisible pathways that spiraled outward into infinity. The carvings had followed me here, their jagged lines glowing faintly, twisting and bending into patterns that seemed alive. The whispers started again. They weren't soft this time. They came sharp and insistent, threading through the hum with an urgency that made my head pound. My name was there, repeated over and over, woven into the cacophony like a single thread in a tangled web. Emma, de Yeguls was file. Emma. The sound of it felt like an intrusion, pressing into my thoughts, carving into the edges of my mind. My body ached with the force of it, as though the air itself had turned against me, pressing down on me from every direction. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My chest heaved, my breaths shallow and ragged as I struggled to move, to do anything to fight the pull of this place. And then the light returned. It seeped through the void, faint at first, a cold greenish glow that bled into the blackness like ink in water. It spiraled outward in jagged patterns, connecting the glowing carvings into a massive, intricate web that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The hum surged louder, vibrating through the light, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. The spiral was back. It wasn't just a carving anymore. It was a physical thing, a massive vortex of light and shadow that twisted and writhed, its edges bending and warping, as though it was tearing through the very fabric of reality. The air around it was sharp and biting, slicing through my skin like tiny blades, the metallic tang of it filling my nose and mouth. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, the cold surface biting into my skin. The shadows moved. They bent and twisted, flickering at the edges of the spiral like they were alive, their jagged forms stretching and bending as they spiraled inward. The whispering grew louder, threading through the hum with a ferocity that made my stomach churn. My hands scraped against the ground as I tried to crawl backward, but the mark on my palm flared, freezing me in place. The icy fire surged through me, rooting me to the spot, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the hum. And then it appeared. The figure stepped out of the spiral, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it moved toward me. Its surface shimmered faintly, translucent and warping, as though it couldn't hold itself together. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me. and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground and into my bones, syncing with the pulsing rhythm of the spiral. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew stronger, suffocating, pressing against me like a physical force. And then the voice came. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was sharp, clear, cutting through the silence with an authority that left no room for resistance. "You cannot leave. You are bound." The words struck me like a blow, sharp and deliberate, carving into my thoughts with an intensity that left no space for denial. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an invisible force, each step pulling me closer to the spiral. The ground beneath me shifted and groaned, the jagged carvings glowing brighter as the hum deepened, vibrating through the very fabric of the space. The spiral twisted violently, its edges bending and warping as though it was alive. The light flared brighter, consuming the room in a blinding burst that made my vision blur. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the void, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed everything was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the spiral twisting violently, bending reality itself until nothing remained. The darkness lifted, but it didn't feel like a return to anything familiar. The air was denser now, the faint metallic tang more pronounced, sticking to the back of my throat. My surroundings had changed again. The space wasn't quite a room anymore. It was a twisting, endless corridor, its walls pulsing faintly with jagged carvings that seemed to shift and grow as I stared at them. The hum had subsided slightly, but its presence was still there, a low vibration threading through my body like a second pulse. I forced myself to move forward, my legs trembling with each step. The ground beneath me was uneven, sharp in places, and seemed to ripple faintly, as though it was alive. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, casting just enough light to guide me, but the shadows were everywhere, flickering and bending unnaturally. My chest tightened with every breath, the weight of the air pressing against me, as if it didn't want me to go any further. The corridor stretched endlessly, each step pulling me deeper into its warped geometry. The carvings grew more erratic the further I went, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling into patterns that defied logic. My head throbbed as I looked at them, the symbols seeming to pulse in time with the faint hum that vibrated through the space. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself, the cold surface biting into my skin. The mark on my palm flared again, its icy fire threading through my veins and rooting itself deep within my chest. It wasn't just pain, it was a pull, dragging me forward with a force I couldn't resist. My legs moved on their own, each step heavier than the last, as the air grew colder, sharper. The faint whispering returned, threading through the hum like a needle, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. Emma. Dut. The sound of my name froze me in place, sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence with an authority that left no room for hesitation. My flashlight flickered violently, its beam casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. The carvings pulsed brighter, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward a faint light at the end of the corridor. I didn't want to keep moving, but my body didn't listen. The pull of the mark was stronger now, dragging me toward the light, even as my instincts screamed at me to turn back. The whispering grew louder, threading through the hum with a ferocity that made my head spin. My breath came in shallow bursts as I stumbled forward, the ground beneath me shifting and groaning with every step. The light at the end of the corridor wasn't natural. It was cold, sharp, and greenish, casting jagged shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls. The air around it shimmered faintly, distorting the space like heat rising from asphalt. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor and into my chest, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. The whispering sharpened, threading through the chaos with an urgency that made my stomach churn. And then I saw it. The figure was waiting for me, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it stepped forward. Its translucent form flickered and warped, as though it couldn't hold itself together, its edges shimmering faintly with the same greenish light as the carvings. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an intensity that made my knees buckle. The corridor closed in around me, the walls twisting and warping, their jagged lines spiraling inward, converging toward the figure. The hum surged louder, vibrating through the space, and the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. The figure raised one elongated arm, its jagged edges bending and twisting, and pointed directly at the light behind it. The voice came again, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence with an authority that left no room for resistance. You are bound. The pact cannot be broken. The words pressed against me, carving into my thoughts, with a clarity that left no room for denial. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an invisible force, each step pulling me closer to the figure and the light beyond it. The air grew heavier with each passing second, pressing against me like a physical weight, dragging me down with every movement. The light flared brighter as I approached, consuming the corridor in a blinding burst that made my vision blur. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very fabric of the space, and the shadows surged forward, collapsing into the light, their jagged forms breaking apart and dissolving into nothingness. The last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the carvings twisting violently, bending reality itself until nothing remained. The light receded, but the air it left behind was suffocating, heavier than before. It wasn't just cold now. It had teeth, gnawing at every inch of exposed skin, dragging me down with each breath. My legs felt weak, and the mark on my palm flared again, sending icy fire through my veins, forcing my body to move forward, even as my mind screamed to stop. I found myself standing in a circular chamber, Heavily too. And the walls weren't stone anymore. They were alive, pulsating and rippling like the surface of water. The carvings stretched across them, their jagged lines glowing faintly, spiraling inward toward the center of the room, where a massive jagged spiral glowed with a sickly green light. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a force, pulling everything toward it, bending reality itself as it twisted and turned. The hum was louder here, no longer just a vibration but a roar that filled the space, resonating deep in my chest, sensing with my heartbeat. The ground beneath me was unstable, shifting with every step as though it were alive. My flashlight flickered violently, its beam casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls, their jagged forms twisting and bending like they were mocking me. And then the whispering returned. It wasn't faint this time. It was loud and sharp, threading through the hum with an intensity that made my head spin. My name was among the voices, repeated over and over, weaving through the cacophony like a needle pulling at the edges of my mind. Emma, Darts, T, Ganon, Fiel, Chats. The sound of it froze me in place, sharp and insistent, cutting through the chaos like a blade. My chest tightened as the weight of the air pressed down on me, dragging at my every movement. The mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire spreading through my veins, sensing with the relentless rhythm of the room. The spiral pulsed violently, its jagged edges bending and twisting as though it were alive. The light from it flared brighter, casting jagged shadows that stretched along the walls, their flickering forms converging toward the center of the room. The whispering grew louder, threading through the hum with a ferocity that made my stomach churn. And then it appeared. The figure rose from the spiral, its translucent form flickering and warping like static, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it moved closer. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an unrelenting force that made my knees buckle. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it made my ears ring. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor and into my bones, sensing with the pulsing rhythm of the spiral. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew stronger, suffocating, pressing against me like a physical force. The carvings along the walls flared brighter, their jagged lines twisting and spiraling inward, converging toward the spiral. The ground beneath me shifted violently, the jagged carvings glowing brighter as the hum surged louder, vibrating through the very fabric of the room. And then the voice came. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence with an authority that left no room for resistance. You are the key. The choice is yours. The words pressed against me, carving into my thoughts with a clarity that left no room for denial. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an unseen force, each step pulling me closer to the spiral. The air grew colder with each passing second, pressing against me like a physical weight, dragging me down with every movement. The spiral twisted violently, its edges bending and warping as though it was tearing through the very fabric of reality. The light flared brighter, consuming the room in a blinding burst that made my vision blur. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the void, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. The figure raised one elongated arm, its jagged edges bending and twisting, and pointed directly at the spiral. The voice came again, sharper now, threading through the hum with an urgency that made my chest tighten. Seal it or be consumed. The words struck me like a blow, sharp and final, carving into the deepest parts of my mind. The light from the spiral flared brighter, consuming everything in its path, bending reality itself as it twisted and wore. The shadows surged forward, collapsing into the spiral, their flickering forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. My hands trembled as the mark on my palm burned brighter, its icy fire spreading through my veins. Syncing with the relentless rhythm of the room, the last thing I saw before the darkness returned was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the spiral twisting violently, consuming everything in its path until nothing. The darkness didn't release me. It clung to my skin, heavy and unyielding, threading its icy tendrils through my veins and wrapping itself around my chest. My breath came in ragged bursts, each inhale catching on the weight pressing against me, as though the air had turned into something sharp and solid. The hum was relentless now, no longer a vibration beneath the surface, but a part of me, syncing with my pulse, consuming every beat of my heart. I stumbled forward, though I couldn't tell if I was being pulled or if my legs were moving of their own accord. The ground beneath me shifted and rippled, its surface jagged and unstable, forcing me to focus on every step. The carvings were brighter now, their jagged lines twisting and bending in ways that made my head throb just to look at them. They weren't just symbols anymore. They were alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the relentless hum. The spiral was ahead, but it had grown, expanding outward, its jagged edges stretching into the infinite darkness. It twisted violently, warping the air around it, pulling everything toward its center like a black hole, devouring the edges of reality. The light it emitted was harsh and cold, its greenish glow casting jagged shadows that stretched and bent unnaturally, flickering like they were alive. The figure was waiting. It stood at the edge of the spiral, its jagged limbs bending and twisting, translucent and flickering like static caught between two channels. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me like a physical force. The hum deepened, resonating through the space, syncing with the pulsing rhythm of the spiral, growing louder with every step I took. The whispering returned, threading through the hum with a sharpness that made my head spin. My name was there again, repeated over and over, cutting through the chaos like a jagged blade. Emma, Tativi, dot home eyes, live. The sound of it froze me in place, sharp and insistent, carving into my thoughts, with an authority that left no room for resistance. My chest heaved as the mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire spreading through my veins, rooting itself deep within me. The air grew heavier, pressing against me like a weight, dragging me down with every breath. The figure raised one elongated arm, its jagged edges bending and twisting, and pointed directly at the spiral. The carvings along the walls twisted violently, their jagged lines spiraling inward, converging toward the center of the room. The light from the spiral flared brighter, consuming everything in its path, bending reality itself as it twisted and warped. The voice came again, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the chaos with an authority that left no room for hesitation. The choice is made. The price must be paid. The words struck me like a blow, sharp and final, carving into the deepest parts of my mind. My legs moved on their own, dragging me forward toward the spiral, its pull stronger now, relentless, unyielding. The air grew colder with each passing second, each breath slicing through my lungs like shards of glass. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very fabric of the space, syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. The ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling. The spiral consumed everything, its jagged edges bending and twisting, pulling me into its infinite darkness. The cold was unbearable, slicing through my skin, sinking deep into my bones. The hum was inside me now, vibrating through every cell, threading through my thoughts, consuming everything I was. And then the light returned. It wasn't the spiral this time. It was sharper, brighter, a blinding greenish glow that seared through the darkness, tearing apart the edges of the void. The figure loomed over me, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending and twisting as it moved closer. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its presence pressed against me with an unrelenting force. The carvings twisted violently, their jagged lines spiraling inward, converging toward the light. The shadows surged forward, collapsing into the spiral, their flickering forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. The hum deepened, resonating through the space, syncing with the pulsing rhythm of the carvings as they flared brighter. The voice came one final time, louder now, cutting through the chaos with a finality that made my chest tighten. Seal it, or it will consume you. The words pressed against me, carving into my thoughts with an intensity that left no room for resistance. My hands trembled as the mark on my palm burned fiercely, its icy fire spreading through my veins, syncing with the relentless rhythm of the room. The spiral twisted violently, its edges bending and warping, bending reality itself as it twisted and turned. The last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the spiral collapsing inward, consuming everything in its path until nothing remained. The light tore through the darkness, blinding and consuming, leaving nothing but its searing glow in its wake. I couldn't move. I couldn't move. The weight of it pressed against me, filling every corner of my chest, seeping into my veins. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a force, threading through my body, vibrating through my bones, tethering me to whatever this place had become. And then it began to fracture. The light splintered like shards of glass, breaking apart into jagged edges that floated in the void, refracting strange patterns of green and black that twisted into infinity. The spiral was still there, but it wasn't just a shape now. It was a presence, an entity, something vast and endless, pulling me closer with every beat of my heart. The mark on my palm burned fiercely, its icy fire spreading through my veins, sensing with the relentless rhythm of the hum. The ground reformed beneath me, jagged and uneven, pulsing faintly with the same sickly green glow as the spiral. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond, my body frozen under the weight of the air pressing against me. The shadows stretched and flickered along the edges of my vision, their jagged forms twisting and bending like they were alive. The figure was waiting. It stood at the edge of the spiral, its jagged limbs stretching impossibly long, bending and twisting at unnatural angles. Its translucent form flickered and warped, as though it couldn't hold itself together, its edges shimmering faintly with the same greenish light as the carving. Its faceless void tilted downward, focusing on me, and the weight of its gaze pressed against me with an intensity that made my chest tight. The whispering returned, sharp and insistent, threading through the hum with a ferocity that made my head spin. My name was there again, repeated over and over, carving into my thoughts like a jagged blade. Emma, da, you, the sound of it froze me in place, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the chaos with an authority that left no room for resistance. My chest heaved as the mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire threading through my veins, rooting itself deep within me. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath slicing through my lungs like shards of glass. The figure stepped closer, its jagged limbs bending and twisting, reaching toward me. The voice came again, louder now, sharp and final, cutting through the hum with an intensity that made my chest tighten. You cannot leave. The pact must be fulfilled. The words pressed against me, carving into my mind with a clarity that left no room for denial. My body moved on its own, dragged forward by an invisible force, each step pulling me closer to the spiral. The ground beneath me shifted violently, the jagged carvings glowing brighter as the hum surged louder, vibrating through the very fabric of the space. The spiral twisted violently, its jagged edges bending and warping as though it was tearing through the fabric of reality. The light flared brighter, consuming the space in a blinding burst that made my vision blur. The shadows surged forward, collapsing into the spiral, their jagged forms breaking apart and dissolving into the light. The voice came one final time, louder than ever, threading through the chaos with a finality that left no room for escape. Choose. It would be tranquil. The words struck me like a blow, sharp and deliberate, pressing against my thoughts with a clarity that made my chest tighten. The mark on my palm flared brighter, its icy fire spreading through my veins. Sensing with the relentless rhythm of the spiral, my hands trembled as the light from the spiral twisted violently, bending reality itself as it consumed everything in its path. And then I saw it. The choice wasn't just mine. It was written in the carvings, in the walls, in the very fabric of this place. The spiral wasn't just pulling me. It was offering me something. A lease, a way to end this. But it wasn't without cost. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization struck me, the weight of it pressing against me with an intensity that made my knees buckle. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the space, sensing with the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. The spiral twisted violently, its edges bending and warping, consuming everything in its path. The last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was the figure's faceless void, tilting downward as though watching my every move, and the spiral collapsing inward, bending reality itself until nothing remained. The rain poured in relentless sheets that blurred the landscape of the Kansas plains, creating a suffocating wall of gray that seemed to swallow all light. We shouldn't have been there. Deep down, I think we all knew it, felt it in the pit of our stomachs as soon as the headlights of Jake's truck illuminated the decaying silhouette of Abaddon Station. The skeletal frame of the abandoned railway depot rose like a monument to forgotten tragedies. Its wood rotted and splintering, the iron of its rails rusted to a deep, corrosive red. The air was heavy, pregnant with the kind of silence that seemed to demand reverence. Or perhaps fear. The station had been closed for decades, its infamy tied to the unsolved disappearance of 17 people. One stormy night 40 years ago, locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed ground. But to us, armed with cameras, microphones, and the naive invincibility of youth, it was the perfect setting for our newest video. We were going to film the definitive ghost hunt, something that would make our channel explode. The comment section always demanded more, and we had promised them something spectacular. Spectacular didn't even begin to cover it. The door to the station hung ajar, creaking faintly as we stepped inside. Stale, suffocating odor enveloped us immediately. The scent of mold and decay so strong, it felt almost tangible. The interior was worse than I imagined. Peeling wallpaper revealing bare, splintering planks, shattered glass crunching underfoot, and a pervasive darkness that swallowed the weak glow of our flashlights. Every step we took sent echoes ricocheting into the void, each sound layered with a faint, almost imperceptible undercurrent of something else. Whispers. Moi, ibani hula, savital, powerful, faint and fleeting. Too faint to grasp, but too vivid to dismiss. And then there was the clock. It hung on the far wall, its face cracked and smeared with grime. But its hands were moving, slowly, deliberately, ticking toward midnight. It didn't make sense. Didn't make sense. There was no power here. No electricity. But there it was, marking time in this dead place, as if mocking our presence. And we should have left, and we should have turned around and walked away. But curiosity is a cruel master, and ambition blinds. It was Emily who found the first real clue. A stack of old yellowed train tickets shoved into the drawer of a ticket booth. Each one was stamped with the same date, October 31st, 1983. That was the night the passengers vanished. As she held one up to the light, her expression shifted, confusion giving way to unease. "Feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't feel anything. Not at first. But then the air grew heavier, colder, wrapping itself around us like a constricting hand. The faint whispers became louder, more insistent, their tone shifting from mournful to malicious. And then, from somewhere deep within the station, we heard it, a train whistle. Low and mournful, it cut through the silence like a blade, freezing us in place. The sound didn't belong here. Not now. Not after so many decades of inactivity. But before we could even voice our disbelief, the vibrations started. The floor beneath us shuddered. The walls groaned, as if under some immense pressure. And outside, the rail lines, long, rusted, and useless, began to hum. The station lights, dead for years, flickered to life in a sickly yellow glow. Shadows twisted and danced along the walls, not matching the angles of our flashlights, but moving independently, as if alive. The sound of the whistle grew louder, closer, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. We stumbled out onto the platform, drawn by a force none of us could resist. That's when we saw it, the train. It emerged from the darkness like a beast from some terrible nightmare, its black iron body gleaming unnaturally under the flickering lights. Steam hissed from its undercarriage, and its windows glowed faintly, revealing silhouettes, people, or something like them. Their forms were indistinct, warped, yet unmistakably watching us. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with a groan, revealing a yawning blackness within. For a moment, none of us moved. It was Jake who broke the spell, stepping forward with his camera, muttering something about getting the perfect shot. The rest of us followed, pulled by a mix of fear and morbid fascination. The platform around us seemed to shift, the edges of reality fraying as the whispers grew into a deafening chorus. When I stepped onto the train, the temperature dropped sharply. The air smelled of ash and iron, and the interior was wrong, impossibly vast, the rows of seats stretching into infinity. Each seat bore a dark, rust-colored stain, and the floor beneath my feet felt damp, almost sticky. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a maddening symphony. I turned to tell the others we needed to leave, but they were gone. They were gone. Panic surged as I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The train lurched, throwing me against a seat, and outside the windows, the world dissolved into a swirling void of black and crimson. The shadows within the train began to coalesce, taking on forms that defied logic, their hollow eyes locking onto me. I realized, too late, that we had made a terrible mistake. The train wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It was alive. The train jerked forward with a violent lurch, dragging me deeper into its impossible expanse. My knees buckled, and I fell hard against one of the seats, the damp, sticky surface soaking through my jeans. The air reeked of burnt metal and something far worse, an acrid, rotten stench that made my stomach churn. The whispers were louder now, their overlapping voices so close they felt like hot breath against my ears. Each word was fragmented, disjointed, impossible to piece together. Yet they clawed at the edges of my mind, threatening to pull me under. I staggered to my feet, gripping the back of a nearby seat for balance. The train car seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its rows of decaying seats bathed in the sickly yellow glow of flickering overhead light. The shadows writhed and twisted, clinging to the corners like living things. As I turned to look out the window, I saw nothing but an impenetrable void, swirling with crimson veins, like blood coursing through some massive, otherworldly body. My reflection in the glass flickered, distorted, as if the train itself was trying to erase me. Jake? I called out, my voice cracking. Emily? Anyone? The only response was the relentless hum of the train, the wheels grinding against the tracks in a rhythm that felt more like a heartbeat than machinery. I moved forward, step by cautious step, the sticky floor pulling at my shoes. Each row I passed felt wrong, as if the train was warping reality itself. The seats weren't just empty. They were inhabited by impressions of what had once been. The faint outline of passengers lingered, their forms flickering in and out like static on an old TV. One of them turned its head. I froze. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. The figure was barely there, a translucent shadow of someone long gone. Its face was hollow, the eyes pits of darkness that seemed to see straight through me. Its mouth opened, a gaping void that emitted a low, guttural sound. Neither human nor animal. My legs felt like lead, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The figure began to rise from its seat, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with broken strings. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and landing hard on the floor. The impact jarred something loose in my mind, and I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering as I bolted toward the next car. The door at the end of the aisle was old and rusted, its edges corroded like the metal had been eaten away by time itself. I grabbed the handle, yanking it open with all my strength, and stumbled into the next car. Dig car. It was worse. This car wasn't empty. The seats were filled with figures, their shapes more defined, though no less terrifying. They sat motionless, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Some were dressed in outdated clothing, their faces frozen in expressions of terror or pain. Others were unrecognizable, their features warped into grotesque caricatures of humanity. The air here was colder, the whispers louder, almost deafening. I forced myself to keep moving, my steps quick and unsteady. As I passed each row, I felt their eyes on me, their hollow gazes following my every move. Ma, one of them twitched, its hand jerking upward, as if to reach for me. My pulse spiked, and I broke into a run, the whispers rising to a crescendo as I reached the far end of the car. The door to the next car loomed ahead, its frame warped and jagged like it had been torn from some horrific nightmare. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the metal icy against my skin. The train lurched again, nearly knocking me off balance, and I heard a sound that chilled me to my core. A faint, distant scream. It wasn't mine. It was Emily's. The sound spurred me forward, my fear momentarily eclipsed by the desperate need to find her. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the next car, only to stop dead in my tracks. This car was different. The seats were gone, replaced by rows of mirrors lining the walls, floor, and ceiling. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, fractured and distorted, each version of myself more grotesque than the last. In one mirror, I was covered in blood, my eyes sunken and lifeless. In another, I was screaming silently, my mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Each reflection was worse than the one before, showing me versions of myself I wouldn't believe. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I forced myself to move forward, each step echoing in the infinite space. The whispers were back, louder now, their words clearer. It's your fault. You shouldn't have come. You can't save them. The voices bore down on me, their accusations striking at something deep inside, something I didn't want to confront. My chest tightened, my breath hitching as the mirrors began to shift. The reflections started moving on their own, stepping out of sync with me, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. They were no longer just reflections. They were watching. I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling for the door to the next car. My fingers found the handle, and I threw the door open, collapsing into the next space. Just as the reflections began to reach for me, the whispers exploded into a deafening roar, drowning out all thought as I slammed the door shut behind me. The silence that followed was almost worse. Able to see you. I was in another car now, the air thick with tension and a faint metallic tang of blood. The floor beneath me felt uneven, like it was shifting subtly, almost alive. Ahead, the faint glow of a single light flickered, illuminating a figure standing at the far end of the car. My heart sank as I recognized her. It was Emily, or at least it looked like her. The figure standing in the faint, flickering light was Emily, or at least some distorted version of her. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her face, her clothes torn and stained with something dark. She was facing away from me, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something just out of earshot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I called her name softly, the sound barely escaping my lips. She didn't move, but the air in the train car was suffocating, thick with the stench of decay, and something else, something sharper, like burnt hair. The dim light overhead flickered erratically, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run back the way I had come. But I couldn't leave her. Not like this. Emily, I tried again, louder this time, my voice trembling. It's me. Are you okay? Her head turned slowly, too slowly, like her neck was resisting the motion. When her face came into view, my stomach churned. Her eyes were wrong. Empty, hollow pits that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Her mouth moved, but no words came out, only a dry, rasping sound, like wind scraping over bone. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears, and then she smiled. It wasn't a human smile. Her lips pulled back far too wide, revealing teeth that were jagged and uneven, as though they'd been shattered and put back together in the wrong order. She took a step toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled hand. Every instinct I had screamed for me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. You came back, she said finally, her voice distorted, layered with tones that didn't belong to her. It wasn't Emily's voice. It was something older, darker. You shouldn't have. The words sent a chill through me, and I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose panel on the floor. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. Emily, or whatever was wearing her face, stopped, tilting her head as if studying me. Her smile widened, impossibly, grotesquely, and her voice dropped to a guttural whisper. They're watching. Before I could react, the lights in the car went out completely, plunging me into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, the sound almost drowning out the whispers that had returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. You should have stayed away. You don't belong here. It's your fault. I scrambled to my feet, my hands outstretched in the pitch-black void, searching for anything to hold onto. The air felt alive, pressing against my skin, and the floor beneath me seemed to shift, as though the train itself was breathing. Then, faintly, a light appeared ahead of me. It was dim and flickering, barely enough to cut through the darkness, but it was something, a direction. I ran toward it, the whispers growing louder with every step, their words twisting into a deafening roar that clawed at my sanity. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing another door at the end of the car. I was recorded. I threw it open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my chest heaving as I tried to steady myself. The new car was eerily quiet, the oppressive darkness replaced by an unnatural stillness. Rows of seats stretched out before me, each one occupied. The passengers were back, unlike the figures I had seen before. These were solid, their forms clearer and more defined, but they weren't alive. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes wide open but unseeing. Some were frozen mid-scream, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. Others sat unnaturally still, their hands clutching at their knees or gripping the edges of their seats as though bracing for impact. The air reeked of death, and the faint hum of the train seemed to echo with the ghost of their last breaths. I moved cautiously down the aisle, my flashlight casting long, distorted shadows. The closer I looked, the worse it got. Their clothes were soaked in blood, some of it dried to a rusty brown, some still fresh and glistening. One figure, a man in a tattered suit, had deep, gaping slashes across his chest, the wounds impossibly clean, as if carved with surgical precision. Another, a young woman clutching a child, had her mouth sewn shut with thick, black thread. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. These weren't just victims. They were warnings. At the end of the car, a faint sound caught my attention. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from one of the seats near the back. I approached cautiously, the tapping growing louder with each step. When I reached the source, I froze. It was Jake. He was sitting, slumped in one of the seats, his head hanging low, his hands tapping against the armrests in a slow, deliberate rhythm. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear. "Jake," I whispered, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed his skin, his head snapped up, and his eyes locked onto mine. They weren't his eyes anymore. They were dark, bottomless voids, just like Emily's had been. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "You can't stop them." Before I could respond, the train shuddered violently, and the lights flickered. A deep, guttural sound reverberated through the car, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. It wasn't the whistle this time. It was something alive, something massive. Jake's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and he leaned closer, his breath cold against my skin. "They want you, too." The train roared to life, its metallic body vibrating with an energy that felt almost sentient. Jake's twisted grin lingered in my vision, even as the lights in the car flickered wildly, plunging me into stuttering darkness. My pulse raced, my chest heaving as I staggered backward, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever Jake had become. The air grew heavier with every breath, thick and suffocating, laced with the faint, acrid smell of burning. The floor beneath me trembled, its texture shifting from cold metal to something almost organic, like flesh stretched taut over bone. I forced myself to move, my shoes sticking with every step, as though the train was trying to hold me in place. Then the whispers returned. They were louder now, no longer faint murmurs, but a relentless chorus of voices, overlapping and cutting into each other like static. Words spilled over one another, fragments of sentences I couldn't fully grasp, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting, accusatory. You should have stayed away. You don't belong here. Run, but you won't escape. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside my head, crawling into the corners of my mind like parasites. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking beneath me, and reached for the door at the end of the car. My fingers closed around the cold, rusted handle, and I yanked it open with all the strength I could muster. The next car wasn't like the others. The air here was colder, biting against my skin like frost. The walls and ceiling were lined with windows, but instead of showing the outside world, or even the void, I saw reflections, dozens of them. Each pane of glass held a version of myself, but none of them were quite right. Some were subtle, just a tilt of the head or an expression that didn't match. Others were grotesque, twisted parodies of my image. One reflection grinned at me, its teeth sharp and bloodied, even though my lips were pressed into a tight line. Another stared back with hollow eyes, its skin pale and rotting. The worst one was near the center, a version of me that was completely still, its face blank, its body limp, like a marionette with its strings cut. I forced myself to look away, my focus locked on the aisle ahead of me. The whispers had grown quieter here, but the silence that replaced them felt worse. It was a void, vast and endless, pressing in on me from all sides. The windows weren't just reflecting me. They were reflecting the space around me. An infinite labyrinth of twisted realities folding into one another. And then, in the corner of one reflection, I saw movement. It was subtle at first, just a shadow slipping through the fractured glass. But as I took a cautious step forward, it grew larger, clearer. A figure emerged in the reflection, tall and skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long, its fingers curling like claws. Its face, or what passed for one, was obscured, shifting and indistinct, as though the train itself refused to let me see it fully. The girl wasn't in the aisle. Well, it wasn't in the car. Well, it was only in the windows, moving closer and closer. its distorted body slipping between reflections, as though the glass were its home. My breathing quickened as I realized it was watching me, its head tilting with an unnatural curiosity. And then, without warning, it stopped. It wasn't in the reflections anymore. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My eyes darted around the car, scanning every shadow, every corner. The light above me flickered again, and in the brief flashes of illumination, I saw it. It was standing at the far end of the car. The thing was massive, its elongated limbs stretching out to scrape against the walls, its head twisted at an impossible angle, its movements jerky and disjointed as it began to move toward me. The sound of its footsteps echoed in the stillness, a wet, squelching noise that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't wait. I ran. My legs felt like lead, my feet sticking to the floor with every step. But adrenaline pushed me forward. The door at the other end of the car loomed ahead, its edges warped and uneven, as though the train itself was trying to swallow it. I reached out, my fingers brushing the handle just as the thing let out a sound, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through my entire body. I yanked the door open and threw myself into the next car, slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled to lock it. The growl echoed through the walls, growing louder, closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Lune. Fi. Shel. El. Silence. I didn't trust it, but I couldn't stay there. The air in this car was different, warmer, almost stifling, and thick with the scent of iron. As I turned to face the aisle, my breath caught in my throat. The floor was covered in blood. It pooled in thick, glistening puddles, dripping from the ceiling and running in rivulets down the walls. The seats were empty, but the outlines of bodies were burned into the fabric, like shadows scorched into the ground after an explosion. The whispers returned, softer this time, weaving through the air like a faint melody. And then I saw her. Emily stood at the far end of the car, her back to me, her head tilted at the same unnatural angle as before. Her body was wrong, her limbs too long, her joints bending in ways they shouldn't. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "They're almost here," she said, her voice echoing with layers of other voices, overlapping and out of sync. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was watch as she took a step forward, her twisted smile widening, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You can't run forever." Emily's whisper lingered in the air, her voice overlapping with others I couldn't place. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to take a step back, my foot splashing in the pooling blood that coated the floor. The wet sound echoed louder than it should have, and Emily's smile twitched, as though my movement had been a signal. Her body shifted unnaturally, bending forward at the waist, while her arms hung limply at her sides. Her head cocked further to the left, almost horizontal now, her hollow eyes unblinking. Then she began to move, not walking, not running, but sliding toward me, her feet dragging as though the train itself was pulling her closer. The sound was unbearable, a wet, scraping noise like flesh against metal. I stumbled back, my hand frantically searching for something to hold on to, something to steady myself. My fingers brushed against the edge of a seat, slick with blood, and I nearly lost my footing. Emily, or whatever had become of her, was gaining on me. Her movements defied logic, the way her body contorted and twisted, her limbs jerking as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. "Stay back!" I screamed, though my voice barely carried over the cacophony of whispers that surrounded me. They were louder now, rising and falling in waves, filling the car with a maddening chorus that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. Emily didn't stop. Beway. Nah. Emily didn't stop. Her pace quickened, her distorted form closing the distance between us. With horrifying efficiency, my back hit the door to the next car, the metal cold against my skin. I reached for the handle, fingers slipping as blood smeared across the surface. She was only feet away now, her smile widening to an impossible degree, her teeth jagged and uneven, her lips cracking and splitting as they stretched. Though wouldn't budge. My heart pounded as I pulled harder, the metal groaning in protest, but refusing to give way. Emily was so close. Now I could feel the chill radiating off her, an unnatural cold that seemed to sap the strength from my limbs. Her mouth opened, and a guttural, otherworldly sound poured out, a mixture of laughter and sobbing that sent shivers down my spine. Then the train lurched violently, throwing both of us off balance. I hit the floor hard, the impact jarring my shoulder, and Emily was momentarily flung backward, her body crumpling like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The lights flickered wildly, casting the car in disorienting flashes of light and shadow. Somewhere beyond the car, I heard it again, the deep, resonant growl that I'd heard before. It was closer now, vibrating through the walls, shaking the very frame of the train. I scrambled to my feet, my hands slipping in the blood as I struggled to regain my balance. Emily was already moving again, her body jerking upright in a way that made my stomach turn. But before she could reach me, the door behind me finally gave way, swinging open with a deafening creak. I didn't think, I just ran. The next car was a nightmare, all its own. The floor was gone, replaced by a chasm of shifting blackness that seemed to go on forever. Thin, rusted beams stretched across the void, forming a precarious path that swayed and groaned with every movement. The walls and ceiling were lined with jagged, broken mirrors, each reflecting warped and distorted versions of myself as I hesitated at the edge of the first beam. Behind me, Emily let out a shriek, a sound so piercing and unnatural that it made my ears ring. I glanced back to see her standing in the doorway, her body silhouetted by the flickering light. She didn't hesitate. She stepped onto the beams with an eerie grace, her movements fluid now, as though the train was guiding her. "Run," the whispers hissed, their voices sharp and insistent. "Rune, or she'll take you." I didn't need to be told twice. I stepped onto the first beam, my legs shaking as it wobbled beneath my weight. The void below seemed to pulse and writhe, and I had the sickening sensation that it was watching me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I moved from one beam to the next, each step a delicate balance between caution and urgency. Emily followed effortlessly, her hollow eyes locked onto me. The beams didn't creak under her weight, didn't sway like they did for me. She moved as though she belonged here, as though the train itself was part of her now. The distance between us was closing fast, and I could feel the cold creeping closer, the air growing heavier with every passing second. "Keep moving," the whispers urged, their voices now a chorus of desperation. "Don't stop. Don't look back." I didn't stop. So I didn't look back. My focus was entirely on the path ahead, the beams stretching into infinity, each one more unstable than the last. The growling sound from earlier was louder now, reverberating through the car, shaking the beams beneath me. It wasn't just Emily I had to worry about anymore. Something else was coming. The final beam was in sight, leading to another door at the far end of the car. My legs burned with exertion, my lungs screaming for air, but I pushed forward, forcing myself to keep going. Behind me, Emily let out another shriek, and the beams trembled violently, nearly throwing me off balance. I reached the door, my hands gripping the handle as I threw it open and stumbled through. I turned to slam it shut, but Emily was already there, her distorted face inches from mine, her smile splitting her face in two. "You can't escape," she hissed, her voice a low, guttural snarl. I pushed the door closed with all my strength, the sound of her laughter echoing in my ears as the latch clicked into place. The growling had stopped, the whispers fading into an oppressive silence. But I knew better than to believe I was safe. The train wasn't done with me yet. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and unnatural. My breath came in shallow gasps as I leaned against the door, my fingers trembling against the cold metal. The train had gone eerily still, as if holding its breath, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat slick on my skin, mixing with the blood that clung to me like a second layer. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I surveyed the car I had stumbled into. This one was different, though the term different had long since lost its meaning on this cursed train. The walls were no longer metal or glass. They pulsed, organic and alive, their surface glistening with a sickly sheen. The floor beneath my feet was warm, faintly throbbing with a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. The smell was overwhelming, coppery, metallic, and suffused with decay. Ahead, the aisle stretched out into the dim, pulsating glow of flickering red lights. The walls seemed to narrow the farther they went, almost as if the train itself was funneling me towards some unseen destination. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to find another way. But there was no other way. There never was. My footsteps echoed wetly as I moved forward, the floor squelching beneath my shoes. Each step felt like a violation, like I was walking through the belly of some immense, malevolent beast. The whispers were gone now, replaced by something worse. A low, rhythmic sound that rose and fell in perfect sync with the pulsing of the walls. It was a breathing, slow, deliberate, impossibly vast. I wasn't alone. The realization settled over me like ice, and I froze mid-step, my flashlight beam darting over the narrow corridor. The shadows here were alive, writhing and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. They crawled along the walls, their forms shifting and coalescing, never fully solid but unmistakably watching me. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a figure hunched and unnatural, partially obscured by the shadows. It stood at the far end of the car, its outline barely visible in the dim red light. My flashlight found it, and I wished it hadn't. The thing was massive, its body stretched and contorted in ways that defied anatomy. Its skin was pale and translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with a dark, viscous fluid. Its limbs were impossibly long, ending in hands with fingers that tapered into sharp, jagged points. But it was the face, or what should have been a face, that rooted me to the spot. There was nothing there, just a blank, smooth surface, like wax, melted over bone. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. And yet I could feel it looking at me, its gaze a physical weight that pressed against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. The creature moved, its body shifting with a sickening liquid grace as it stepped forward. Each step sent a tremor through the floor, the pulsating walls shuddering in response. I took a step back, then another, my flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. The thing paused, tilting its head as if amused by my retreat. And then it spoke. The sound didn't come from its non-existent mouth. Adieu. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that was both deafening and barely audible, threading itself into my thoughts like a needle through fabric. Why do you run? The words clawed at my mind, filling my head with images I didn't want to see. Jake's twisted grin, Emily's hollow eyes, the blood-stained floor. My back hit the wall, and I realized too late that I'd cornered myself. The thing moved closer, its limbs stretching impossibly as it reached for me. You cannot escape. You were always meant to be here. The words were a knife, cutting through the thin threads of my sanity. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if the train itself was conspiring against me. I felt its presence pressing in, the air growing colder, heavier, suffocating. My fingers fumbled at my belt, searching for something, anything, that could keep it at bay. They closed around the metal handle of my pocket knife, and I drew it with a shaking hand. Stay back. I screamed, though the sound felt pitiful, swallowed by the oppressive weight of its gaze. The creature paused, its head tilting again, as though considering my defiance. Then it moved faster than I thought possible, its jagged fingers swiping through the air, inches from my face. I ducked, my body moving on instinct as the knife in my hand slashed out. The blade met resistance, slicing through something cold and wet. The creature let out a sound, a high-pitched, keening wail that resonated through the walls, shaking the entire car. I stumbled backward, my knife slick with the dark, viscous fluid that oozed from its wound. The train reacted violently. The walls pulsed faster, the floor buckling beneath my feet, as the breathing sound rose to a deafening crescendo. The creature reared back, its body convulsing as if the train itself was feeling its pain. I took the chance and ran, my feet slipping on the shifting organic floor as I bolted toward the far end of the car. The door loomed ahead, its edges warped and twisting as though the train didn't want me to leave. Behind me, the creature let out another wail, the sound chasing me like a wave of pure malice. I reached the door and threw myself against it, my hands scrabbling for the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Come on," I muttered through gritted teeth, slamming my shoulder into the door. It groaned under the force, the metal twisting as I pushed harder. Phew! The creature's footsteps were closing in, each one sending a tremor through the floor. Finally, with a sound like tearing flesh, the door gave way, and I fell through into the next car. The last thing I saw before the door slammed shut behind me was the creature's faceless head, inches from mine, its jagged fingers reaching for me. Then the latch clicked, and the world went silent. The silence after the door slammed shut was all-encompassing, an oppressive stillness that pressed down on me, filling the air like a weight. My breath came in shallow gasps as I leaned against the door, gripping the handle as if holding it would keep whatever was on the other side at bay. The faint glow of the flickering lights overhead cast weak, uneven shadows, but the dark corners of the train car seemed alive with unseen movement. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs shaking beneath me. This car was different from the others. It was vast, impossibly so. The floor beneath my feet was slick and damp, reflecting the dim light in an unnatural sheen. The walls pulsed faintly, as though they were alive, and the air was colder here, carrying with it an odd metallic tang. I moved cautiously, each step accompanied by the faint squelch of the floor beneath my weight. The car stretched endlessly ahead, and with every passing moment, I felt as though I was walking deeper into the heart of something I couldn't understand. Shadows twisted at the edge of my vision, shapes I couldn't quite place, but that seemed to watch my every move. Ahead, a faint glow began to take shape. It pulsed in time with the rhythmic thrum I'd felt since entering this part of the train. The light grew stronger as I approached, illuminating the space around it. At its center stood something that defied explanation, a massive, grotesque amalgamation of metal and organic material. Its surface rippling like the skin of some great sleeping creature. Pipes jutted out at irregular angles, and gears clicked and turned with slow, uneven movements. In the center of the machine was a light, faint and flickering, like the last ember of a dying fire. I couldn't look away from it, though every instinct told me I should. The glow was weak, but it seemed to pull at something deep within me, drawing me closer. As I stepped toward it, the ground beneath me trembled. The shadows grew darker, and the air grew heavier, suffused with a low hum that resonated deep in my chest. I could feel the presence of something vast and unknowable, something that had been waiting for me. The whispers that had haunted me earlier returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Their words were fragmented, overlapping, and impossible to piece together. Yet the tone carried a weight I couldn't ignore. The light flickered, growing brighter for a moment, and I saw something within it, a shape, indistinct but undeniably human. It reached out toward me, and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The machine shuddered, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar, their voices merging into a single, overpowering sound. I clutched my head, the noise overwhelming, and the room seemed to spin around me. The light flared brighter, and I saw faces, brief flashes of people, their expressions frozen in moments of fear or despair. They seemed to be calling out to me, though no words escaped their mouths. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The light held me in its grip, forcing me to confront what it wanted to show me. And the machine groaned, its gears grinding and clanking as the floor beneath me began to shift. I staggered, struggling to keep my balance, and for a moment I thought I heard something else, a voice, faint and distant, cutting through the cacophony. It wasn't part of the whispers. It was something different, something real. Elviously, assured, in real. I turned toward the sound, and the light dimmed, the room falling into a strange, muted stillness. The voice came again, clearer this time, calling my name. It was familiar, though I couldn't place it. I followed it, moving toward the far end of the car, away from the machine and its hypnotic glow. As I walked, the air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. The whispers faded into silence, replaced by a faint, rhythmic sound. The soft hum of the train, moving along the tracks. The walls here were solid, the floor steady beneath my feet. I reached the door at the end of the car, and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Behind me, the faint glow of the machine flickered one last time before disappearing entirely, plunging the car into darkness. I ran back toward the door, my breath steadying as I reached for the handle. The metal was cold against my fingers, but it gave easily as I pushed it open, stepping through into the next space. The air here was different, clean and crisp, and the train car was empty. The seats were neatly arranged, the walls pristine, and for a moment I thought I had escaped. But as I moved toward the center of the car, I saw my reflection in the window. It wasn't mine. I knew feel, but the figure staring back at me was familiar but wrong. Its features were distorted, its eyes hollow and lifeless. I reached out to touch the glass, but the reflection didn't mimic my movements. Instead, it smiled, its lips curling into an expression that sent a chill down my spine. The train shuddered, and the lights flickered. I turned away from the window, my heart pounding as I made my way toward the next door. Whatever waited on the other side, I knew it wasn't over. The train wasn't done with me yet.